Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear students, you're welcome back to the e-learning portal of Citywide Model College, Ibadan. Today, we shall continue with the Business Studies class for Week 4, Lesson 2, presented by Adirogba. And the topic is the sources of capital to limited liability companies. We have started limited liability company last week, and I have defined it to you. I also told you that there are two types of limited liability companies: the private limited liability company and the public limited liability company. And I told you the number of people that can form the two types. I told you for the private limited liability company, you have two people can start it, and the maximum of 50 people. And for the public limited liability company, minimum of 7, and there's no maximum to number of people that can be shareholders or owners of a public limited liability company. We looked at some of the features of a limited liability company. So today, inshallah, we shall be looking at the sources of capital available to limited liability companies. Don't forget, we are still on the forms of business organization. Okay, so the first source of capital to limited liability company is shares raised by shareholders. I told you what a share is. A share is the contribution of each member or each owner of the limited liability company. I told you that shares of public limited liability company can be advertised to the general public. So we use a term for it. It can be quoted on the stock exchange. That is, it can be advertised on the stock exchange. The stock exchange is like a market where shares are advertised for sale. So the shares raised by shareholders is one of the source of capital. All members or all owners or shareholders in a company. I hope you remember who a shareholder is. Anybody that has a share in a company is a shareholder. So they contribute to the capital of the business. So with that, the business can raise some funds. The second source of capital to limited liability company is loans and overdraft from banks. The company can approach banks for loans. They have the opportunity to get loans and overdraft from banks than small firms like a sole proprietorship business because of their size and their capital base. Banks believe that they are more financially stable than small firms, so they have the better opportunity to get loans from banks. Another source of capital is retained or plowed back profit. I've been explaining this. This continues to reoccur in all the sources of capital to all firms, to all businesses. Retain or plow back profit. Profit that the business uh, has gained or is able to get. The profit realized by the business, which shareholders did not share among themselves. Rather, they put it back into the business. The next is trade credits. Trade credit facilities from suppliers. Businesses can enjoy credits from those that are supplying them raw materials or the goods they sell. They make these supplies before payment is made for them. So that's trade credits. A credit facility enjoyed by the business from those supplying them raw materials or the goods they sell. So they supply these goods or raw materials on credit. Equipment leasing is another source of capital. I've explained this too before, but let me talk about it briefly. Equipment leasing is when the business leases out its assets. It gives other businesses opportunity to make use of its assets or facilities while they make payments for the period of time they make use of these assets or facilities. So this is a source of capital to the business or the limited liability company. Another one is hire purchase. Hire purchase is when the business can buy some assets or facilities for the business and make payments in installments. So they continue to use the assets or the facility, but they before they make final payment for the goods, so they continue to use the asset, and they make payment instrumentally, bit by bit. Another one is that public limited liability companies can issue debenture. Only public limited liability company can issue debenture. Private limited liability company cannot issue debenture. What is a debenture? A debenture is an instrument that public limited liability used to borrow money from members of the public. It can borrow money from members of the public using a debenture. But a private limited liability company cannot use a debenture. It cannot issue a debenture. So public limited liability company can raise money from the public by issuing debenture. That's that on the sources of capital available to limited liability companies. Now we are going to look at the management and control of the limited liability companies. What do I call it? The management and control of the limited liability company. We want to see how limited liability companies are managed or controlled, both the private and the public. Both the private and the public limited liability companies are controlled or managed by a body known as the board of directors. The body that controls the limited liability company is called what? The board of directors. Once again, the board of directors. Okay, the members of the board of directors are elected by the shareholders. The board employs people who are paid wages and salaries to run their business. Once the limited liability company is formed, among the shareholders, that is for a private limited liability company, among the shareholders, some people will be elected to make up the board of directors. So the board of directors will be the one that will manage, that will be at the ends of affairs. They'll be the decision maker for the business. They'll be the controller of the business. They'll be the one to make decision for the business. Whatever decision that we made on the business must be made, they must stamp it. They must give the final verdict on such decisions. They must give the final they must give the go ahead before such decisions can be taken in the business. So the body or the board of director is usually at the ends of affairs, the major decision maker for the business, the controller of the limited liability companies. For private limited liability companies, the board of directors is formed by selecting some people among the shareholders. So some people will be selected or elected among the shareholders to form the board of directors. While for the public limited liability companies, the board is usually formed from people outside the business. Are you there? For public limited liability company, the board of directors is usually formed. That is, those that will be members of the board of directors are usually not among the shareholders of the business. Are you with me? So, the board of directors is usually in control of their business. They are usually at the ends of affairs. They are the ones that make decision for their limited liability company, both the private and the public. I hope my point is clear. Okay, so now we're going to look at the advantages of a limited liability company. The first advantage there is that there is limited liability. In limited liability company, the first advantage of a limited liability company is that in limited liability companies, more capital can be raised than the sole proprietorship or partnership business. More capital can be raised. Don't forget, we have more people forming limited liability companies. So the number of people that will form limited liability companies is more than the number of people that can form a sole proprietorship or a partnership business. With that, they will have more capital from these people. The second advantage of a limited liability company is that the shareholders or the members of a limited liability companies or the owners of a limited liability companies enjoy limited liability. I hope you remember what that means. When we say shareholders or the owners of the business, they enjoy limited liability. Do you remember what limited liability means? It means that when there's a business debt, only the money they have contributed into the business will be sacrificed. It is only the money they have contributed, only the capital they have contributed in the business that they will forgo, that they will sacrifice, that they will leave, that will be used to pay up the debt. They don't have to use their personal belongings. They don't have to sell their personal assets to pay up the debt. So shareholders or owners of limited liability company enjoy limited liability. The third is that the death or withdrawal of a shareholder does not lead to the end of the business. Unlike a sole proprietorship business, that when the owner dies or is no longer available to continue running the business is going to die. Or a partnership business, when the active partner dies or leaves, the business may not continue. But for a limited liability company, when when one of the shareholders die, it does not end the business. The business will continue to exist with the contribution of other shareholders. And new shareholder can even be admitted into the business. Another advantage of a limited liability company is that the risk of the business is shared among many people. The risk of the business is shared among many people, and with that, the burden of the burden of the risk or debts of the business will not be too much for each of them. The fifth advantage of a limited liability company is that limited liability companies can take advantage of large-scale production because of their size. Because limited liability companies are usually big, so they can produce in large quantity. And when you produce in large quantity, it will reduce your cost per unit. That is, the amount of money you spend in producing one unit will reduce, and then your profit will also increase. They enjoy all this because they are big. Another one is that ownership can be transferred in limited liability companies. You can transfer your shares when you're no longer interested, or when somebody dies, the share can be transferred to another person. Another advantage is efficient management. Efficient management, as experts manage the limited liability companies. Don't forget, aside that, the board of directors will employ people to work for the firm, to work for the company. Don't forget, I told you the board of directors is the body that make decision for the limited liability companies. So they usually employ people to work for the business. So they ensure that they employ competent people, and they are also there too. They are experts in their fields. They are also there too to manage the affairs of the business. And with this, there will be efficient management. There will be regular checks and balance, regular monitoring, and this to bring about efficient management of the business. The next advantage, which happens to be the last here, is that limited liability companies enjoy large profits due to their size. Don't forget, they are usually big, so they enjoy large profit. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages of limited liability companies. 1. Lack of privacy. Limited liability companies cannot keep their business affairs private. Unlike sole proprietorship and partnership businesses that do not have to publish or publicize their accounts or the amount of profit they make or the amount of loss they make, for limited liability companies, they have to let outsiders usually know how much profit or how much loss they make. For the private limited liability companies, they do not publish their accounts. You know what I mean by publishing? To publish means you go to the newspapers or magazines and they will publish your statement of account, how much profit you made, how much loss you made. It will be written in the magazines or newspapers, and everybody in the country will have access to it. Everybody in the country will know how much profit you make or how much loss you make. So for the private limited liability companies, they do not publish their accounts, but they submit their statement of account to the Corporate Affairs Commission. And for the public limited liability companies, they must publish their accounts in national newspapers, that is newspapers that is read nationwide in all parts of the country. They must publish their account. It is a must. They must publish their annual statement of account in national newspapers or magazines for general public's consumption. The second disadvantage of limited liability companies is that there may be conflict of interest among shareholders and the board of directors. There may be conflict of interest among shareholders and the board of directors. The shareholders are the owners of the business. The board of directors are those that are making decisions for the business. Sometimes what the owners want may be different from what the board wants, especially the public limited liability company, where the board of directors is usually formed from people outside the business. So what they want for the business may be different from what the owners of the business want, and this can cause conflicts of interest between them. The next disadvantage is that limited liability companies are difficult to establish. It involves complicated processes and legal expenses in order to establish it. Unlike sole proprietorship businesses and partnership businesses that do not require rigorous formal procedures to establish it, all that you need is registration of business name. You only need to go to the Corporate Affairs Commission and register the name of your business. That's all, and you can start your business. But for limited liability companies, they must prepare some documents. I think I mentioned some of them at the last class, which will be signed and stamped and lodged at the Corporate Affairs Commission. They must file some documents, as I've said earlier, and they must undergo some processes before they are being issued certificate of incorporation. And for the public limited liability companies, after receiving the certificate or obtaining the certificate of corporation, they can still not start operation yet. They still have to work. They still have to continue the processes till they are able to obtain their certificate of trading before they can start operation. So it's usually not easy to start or establish a limited liability companies. You must undergo some rigorous formal procedures. You must prepare some documents that has to be submitted, scrutinized, stamped. When the Corporate Affairs Commission is satisfied by them, they will be lodged, and then you continue with the procedures before you are issued the certificates that is required to start the business. Another disadvantage of limited liability companies is payment of large corporate tax. Because they are big companies, government usually tax them heavily. Payment of large corporate tax. A huge amount of money is usually paid by companies to the government as tax. The fifth disadvantage is that large capital is required to set up and run a limited liability company. You cannot just start a limited liability company, you must have huge capital available. That's why it's usually difficult for some public limited liability companies to obtain their certificate of trading if they are unable to raise the capital that they have how do I put it, stated in their nominal nominal capital statement of nominal capital. They will not be allowed to commence operations, so they will not be given their certificate of trading. The next disadvantage is that there is decrease in personal interest compared to the sole proprietorship business. The limited liability company is owned by so many people. So that interest, that personal interest that is there for the sole proprietor, that is the only one that owns it, he puts his mind, his everything into it, concentrates, he sacrifices a lot for the business. But for the limited liability company, they will only do what they can, and most of them, they have other businesses that they manage. So the personal interest in limited liability company will not be as much as that of a sole proprietorship business. The other one is that another disadvantage of sole proprietorship business is slow decision making. The major stakeholders of the company must be consulted before a decision is made. Before they arrive at any decision at all, the board of directors must meet. They must hold meetings upon meetings before a decision is made. The next is that another disadvantage of a limited liability company is that workers do not have direct contact with the owners of their companies. Workers do not have direct contact with the owners of their company. The business is big. They have appointed the board of directors. So the board of directors are the ones that will be dealing with the workers. So the workers might not even know some of the owners of the business. So these are some of the disadvantages of unlimited liability companies that we are going to look at today. So we have looked at how the limited liability company is controlled and managed. It is controlled and managed by the board of directors. We have also looked at some of the sources of capital available to a limited liability company. And we have also looked at the advantages and the disadvantages of limited liability company. So this is where we are going to stop today, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. So by next class, inshallah, we shall continue from there. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.